welcome. Welcome to the fifth and final presentation in the Stream Team Academy's course on an introduction to mussels. Thank you guys, everybody, for coming in and sharing your time with us on Friday morning. Looking forward to the weekend, I hope. Today we have Travis Moore once again to join us for talking to us about some pretty cool stuff. Large river mussel issues, and then outreach opportunities for Stream Team volunteers, to kind of help in the cause of protecting our mussel population. So Travis is coming to us from Hannibal, Missouri. Our Northeast regional office. He's been with the department for 30 years, and we are just very thankful to have him here today. So with that, Travis, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Let me share. Okay. And I'll reduce that one down. Okay, so as Amy said, I do a lot of my freshwater mussel work on some of the interior streams up here in Northeast Missouri, but my predecessor did a lot of work on the Mississippi River. And so, I have a little bit of a unique experience. I walked into the job. There were some previous projects that person had been working on, and there was an expectation that I needed to pick those up and run with them, and I knew nothing about mussels. So most of my experience has been learning on the job and working with folks like Steve and his predecessor and Chris Barnhart and Andy and all these other folks that you've gotten to see presentations from. So I'm going to give two short presentations today. First one will be on some of the large river mussel work that's going on, some of the activities there. And then a second presentation is going to be on some mussel outreach opportunities. I'll show you some things that you can do if you're working at a fair, if you're doing classroom activities, or even if you want to reach out to some very unique groups that they may not realize that they have an interest in mussels, but you can show them how they do. And I'll start off with this large river mussel issue presentation. It's going to be a little bit of a blending of some of the current stuff that's going on, as well as some of the historical perspectives. And so you're going to see some photos and some information that goes back quite a ways. And just as an example, this picture is from a book that's over 100 years old. It's called Pearls and Pearling. And in this photo, there's a freshwater mussel there, and it's full of the freshwater pearls that are misshapen. They are oftentimes called plugs or slugs. And so I just thought it was kind of a neat photo and a good introduction to some of the big river issues that we were working on out there. Okay, so when we talk about large river issues, primarily the big rivers that we talk about are the Missouri and the Mississippi. And then I oftentimes do include the St. Francis in that because those are streams where we have had some sort of commercial activity, whether it be fishing, and in some cases it was musseling as well. And when we look at the historical perspective of the Missouri River and then the Mississippi River from St. Louis down to the Ohio, a lot of the historical information shows that there probably wasn't much in the way of a mussel resource in those big rivers. And a lot of it ties to the shifting sand, the meandering channels that there just wasn't that stable substrate in, heavily silted, just a lot of different things that would have played into that. And I always find that really interesting because when we look in the state at some of our best mussel streams, on the Missouri, you look at the tributaries like the Lamine, the Osage, and the Gasconade are incredibly diverse and have lots of mussels in them. You get into that lower section of the Mississippi River and you have the Merrimack Basin, which is one of our most diverse rivers. And it's always interesting that they had lots of mussels, but the streams they fed into didn't. For me up here on the upper Mississippi River, we actually have and have always had a pretty good mussel resource. You go in this section of river we call the pooled portion of the upper Mississippi River, which goes from St. Louis up. And there are beds that I can go out and survey, and we may find 25 or 30 species in an individual bed. So very diverse. And then again, in the St. Francis, a lot of different mussels down that direction and pretty good numbers down there as well. So when we talk about the differences from our interior streams and going into our big rivers, we always have to talk a little bit about scale. And in our interior streams, you may be looking at a site that may be just a few feet long to, maybe 10 or 15 yards long, or in some cases, you may start to get in some places where you have a 100-yard mussel bed out at that site. But when we look at our big rivers, the scale is obviously much bigger. And in this particular photo, you're looking at, on that opposite bank, just a portion of the mile-plus long mussel bed that's known as the Fabius mussel bed. And lots of animals out there. We've surveyed parts of this at different times. And unfortunately, it's so big, we don't survey the entire bed. We just have to take sections or cross sections of it and try to get an idea about what's there. So our big rivers, the Corps of Engineers has been mandated by Congress to maintain a 9-foot navigation channel for the towboat and barge industry. There's a lot of goods that are moved up and down our rivers, and there's a couple of ways that they maintain that navigation channel. One is to do the dredging. They would actually get out there and scoop up the material in that navigation channel to try to increase the depth. The other way that they do that is through a series of locks and dams. And the locks are there to allow the towboats and the barges to get from one pool to the next. And the dams themselves don't work the same way that a dam does, say, on Lake of the Ozarks or Mark Twain Lake or Smithville. Instead, they raise the level of the river a little bit, but you still have a lot of water that's flowing through them all the time. And so I always describe our pools up here as these big flowing pools rather than being a reservoir. So that lock and dam system extends from St. Louis all the way up into the Minnesota-Wisconsin boundary. In Missouri, there are 6 dams, but 7 locks. There's an extra lock down in the St. Louis area, just a little bit upstream of the arch. And you can see that throughout our reach, going from Lock and Dam 19, which is on the Iowa border at Keokuk, all the way down to St. Louis, most of these dams don't have a huge difference between the upper and lower pool, but cumulatively it adds up. It's almost 150 feet of difference from above Keokuk to below St. Louis. And you can imagine our historic river would have looked much different when you included all of that fall along the way. The Mississippi River is being described as having braided channels up in my reach around Hannibal. And the father of a former employee told me had told his son that prior to the dams going in a dry year, a grown adult could wade across the river at Hannibal. Just not possible today. We've just got too much depth up there and too much flow. Historic uses, of course, the Native Americans used freshwater mussels. There were some tribes that fed on them. There were a lot of them that used the shell to grind up and use them as tempering and pottery. They would have used them for jewelry, for tools, just a lot of different things. And one of the stories that I tell here, back several years ago, Steve McMurray and I got an opportunity. MoDOT had excavated a site near a highway up here south of Hannibal. And we had gotten an opportunity to go down and look through the shell that they had found at that particular site. And the thing that was really neat about it is they were telling us about how long that shell had been underground, how long it originated ago. And that date was prior to when Christopher Columbus sailed. And so it was really neat to have that perspective about the material that we were looking at. Late 1800s, early 1900s, you've seen in some of the other presentations, the pearl button industry came about, and those folks were really indiscriminate as far as their harvest. If they could punch a single button out of a shell, it got harvested. So even the little stuff was being picked up. And then, of course, if it was a bigger shell, then they could make more buttons out of it. Start getting into the more modern area, and the cultured pearl nuclei were the main focus. 1960s into the early 2000s here in Missouri. And they would primarily harvest one of three species, either washboard mussels were the thicker ones, three ridges, and then in some cases, maple leaves were being harvested as well. So this is a historic graph showing some harvest, and it's a little bit grayed. The top end of the scale is 4,000 tons harvested, but those first couple of bars are over 8,000 tons. So in the late 1800s, folks got out there and they really harvested all the easy shell. They could wade out, they could start picking up a lot of stuff, and they really hurt our population back then. I don't think that's a level that we'll ever get back to. But they harvested all the easy shell, and then of course you can see as it got harder for them to find, the price came up, and the harvest kind of leveled off in through there. But by the 1930s, the lock and dam system went in. And so that flooded a lot more water, or a lot more places where mussels were historically collected, made them harder to get to, and plastics came around. So a lot of the buttons were being made out of plastics by then. There just wasn't much call for them to harvest mussel shell.
Hey, Travis, Andy actually had a really great question. He was wondering if that first lock and dam actually captures a lot of sediment, and if so, does the core actually remove that material? And that's so, talking, currently.
Yeah, so different dams do catch quite a bit of sediment. If you go up to Keokuk, they actually have a little bit of an issue up there where there used to be a rapids there, and so the dam flooded the rapids, and in doing so, it created a sediment trap. And there's a huge amount of sediment that is being caught up there, and to the point that American lotus, one of the plants that's out there, aquatic plants that's out there, there are these huge beds of that plant out there growing well out towards the main channel. And so they do some dredging primarily just around the navigation channel, but they don't worry about the rest of it. So they're kind of creating a wetland habitat up in that area, which can be good for some fish and especially some waterfowl. So
thank you.
Yep. In the 1960s, the mussel was starting being used for the pearl nuclei. You can see there was a bump in harvest then. And again, they got what was easy at the time. The price came up. And then by the 1980s, diving became one of the primary methods of harvest and made it more of the shell accessible. We've gotten to the point, though, that in Missouri, by the last permit that we sold, harvest permit that we sold in Missouri was in the early 2000s. We'd gone over 10 years without having any permit sales. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, we just went ahead and eliminated that permit altogether. So if I'm going to be doing some sampling for mussels in the big rivers, what are the things I'm looking for? It's a lot very similar to what we would look for in our interior streams. We might look on a gravel bar or sandbar for shells on those sites. I might look for muskrat middens, where they've gone out, harvested a mussel and eaten the animal inside, deposited the piles of shell. Those are good indications we've got mussels in an area. But I may also use a traditional method, which is called a mussel brail or a crowfoot bar. And a crowfoot bar has these hooks that we've manufactured. They don't have barbs, but they do have kind of a point to them. You put those on either ropes or chains and space them out a little bit. And then you put those chains onto a bar, which you can then drag on the bottom of the river. And what ends up happening is as you're dragging along, those hooks are tickling the bottom. The mussels are burrowed into the substrate. And then as this hook goes into the two halves of the shell, mussel thinks something's trying to get it. It responds and clamps down. And so you end up pulling that mussel up out of the substrate. Now, in this photo, you can see a lot of my hooks are starting to get straightened out. So I would need to recondition those, rebend those. I do have some hooks that were on this brail that have a little ball on the end. And those are both good and bad. It's hard to lose mussels whenever you've got that on there. but it does tend to chip the shell whenever you go to pull them off. So I prefer these that don't have the balls on the end. But they are useful in some other places where there's lots of big rock. So the crowfoot bars or brails were the most common method in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and even into the the middle of the 1900s. They were used quite a bit, and most of the boats were long and narrow. And you can see that each of these boats actually does have 2 crowfoot bars on. They would put one on each side of the boat. They would throw one out on the upstream side, and as they're drifting their way down, it's fishing, it's musseling. And when they got to where they were ready to pull that one up, it would come up, they would spin the boat around, the other braille would go out, and then you could pick mussels off of the first one while the second one was fishing. Now you may notice there's something missing from all of these boats. They didn't have motors. So if you're throwing out something that's dragging the bottom and hooking on a lot of stuff, how do you keep the boat moving? Well, they used what was called a mule, and it was a big underwater sail, had a heavy bar on the bottom end with ropes going to it, and then a mainstay in the center of it. And if you wanted to go to the right, just like steering a horse team, you would pull on the reins to the right. The current would then pull that and pull the boat to the right, or if you want to go left, you just pull it the other direction. And it was a very effective method for moving, especially because you want to be moving at the pace of the current to make the braille work its best. And they harvested a lot of shell that way. The button factories had, literal mountains of shell. And I've been told even here in Hannibal that parts of the downtown area are actually built over some of the old spent shell. We had a couple of button factories here in town. They would have deposited a lot of that material out and then just cap it off with a little topsoil and build on top of it. Other methods we can use, if we're in a shallower site, we can wade or polywog or grub, depending on what terminology you like. If we're looking at some places a little bit deeper water, we can don our scuba gear and get out there and work around in that area as well. And then if I'm dealing with a spot where it's deeper water or faster current, then I'll contract with a diver who has surface air. We can communicate with them, and they'll use the diving bell to go down and start collecting mussels and send them up to the surface for us. And a lot of folks do ask, so what's it like to go out there and go diving into the Mississippi River? Well, here's what it looks like. And it's dark. Although our divers do tell us if they're in about 10 to 15 of water, they do have a little bit of visibility. And you'll hear them talk about, they'll say, hey, I think I found this mussel. And they'll put it right up against their mask and be able to make out the outline and tell, yeah, it's one of these. But we had a diver that did some work for us quite a few years ago, and he had an aircraft light mounted on the top of his diving helmet. And he said, even with that, he said, I can only see about a foot in front of me. So most time they just do it in the dark, feel around, and try to see what they can find. We find mussels in all kinds of different habitat. There are some that prefer the silty sites. There's some that prefer the pea gravel, others that like sand. And then we'll find a lot of stuff in the spaces in between a lot of the bigger rock as well. We talk about speckled case being in the Merrimack system, and that's a species that I do have in a couple of sites in the Mississippi River as well. And just like the sites that Steve finds them in, we find them in those spaces in the big rock as well. Biggest issues that affected our mussels out here, of course, overharvest was one of them. Pollution has been a pretty significant issue because clear up into the 1970s, a lot of the towns along the river were literally dumping raw sewage right straight into the river. And then sedimentation. A lot of the channelization that's gone on in the tributary streams that flow into our big rivers released a lot of sand, a lot of other material and that stuff is finally making its way out into the Mississippi River. And you can imagine if there was a big slug of it coming down, it can completely cover a mussel bed. Navigation itself can be a problem because one of my better sites is a little bit downstream of a lock and dam. And what the towboats will do is if they're waiting their turn to go through the lock, they will run aground. And in order to hold in place, they'll keep the propellers running. So you can imagine that they're stirring up sediment, they're dislodging animals, dislodging some of the gravel, and that can be a problem. And then, of course, where they're dredging to maintain the navigation channel, if they have to do very much of that, obviously it's not going to be a stable site where mussels could survive. The other thing that we run into related to navigation, this is the lock and dam, or this is the dam at Keokuk, and it's a hydropower facility. And in order to be able to generate that electricity, they have to have quite a bit of head difference between the upper and the lower pool. And so at this particular site, there's 38 feet of difference between this lower pool and the upper one. Well, if we had fish species that like to migrate in order to spawn or to expand their populations, they're obviously not going to get past this dam unless they're going to go through the lock. And that's problematic for some mussels and some fish that rely on each other. The skipjack herring is a species of fish that used to run up the Mississippi River all the way into Wisconsin. And they would talk about their numbers would be so great up there that on a moonlit night, the water would just shimmer from the backs of all the skipjacks. For the longest time, the ebony shell mussel was the only known host for the skipjack. And so since skipjack couldn't get up into the northern waters anymore, ebony shell numbers above Keokuk have almost gone to zero because they just can't get up there very easily. So it always begs that question, what did the skipjack say when it hit its head on the concrete wall? Damn. Some of the biological concerns, of course, we've talked about zebra mussels before. In that bottom left-hand photo, you can see some of the dark blotches down here. These are places where zebra mussels were once attached to these mussels. And so that can be problematic for them as they're feeding and burrowing and just trying to survive. Black carp is a fish species that's on the scene more recently over the last 10 years or so. Their numbers continue to grow, and they are a mollusk eater. They end up eating snails and freshwater mussels, and they have throat teeth that can crush those shells. And then even common carp have very similar throat teeth, and they've been observed feeding in mussel beds and picking up small freshwater mussels too. How are they doing? In a survey we did back in the early 2000s, that on one particular bed, almost 3/4 of the population was comprised of just 6 species. So there are some species that have definitely adapted well to this flowing pool habitat, but there's some others that are still kind of struggling. Things like the monkey face, they're just not as prevalent as they once were. But it's always encouraging to see these juveniles showing up in a population, and that means we're getting some reproduction out there. But not everything's doing great. One of the species that's almost disappeared from the Mississippi River, and this goes all the way up into the Minnesota, Wisconsin waters as well, is the deer toe. Was once one of the most common, probably would have always been one of the top 2 or 3 species that we would have collected in the 1990s. And by that time of the survey in the early 2000s, we almost didn't collect them at all. They were less than 1/10 of 1% of the total population. And we just don't know why they've disappeared. We don't know if it's been a disease, if there's some pollution, or if it could have been something like zebra mussels that had caused it. Again, talking about the importance of freshwater mussels, and you've seen some reference to these previously. You put 8 mussels into an aquarium, stir up the sediment, and then 8 hours later, that water looks like it's practically good enough to drink. And the Fish and Wildlife Service reports that 5,000 mussels could remove 55,000 pounds of silt in just 1 year. And when you consider the number of mussels that we have in the Mississippi River, that's a pretty significant impact of removing some of that sediment from our big rivers. One of the things that's kind of interesting is we get to see some interesting places. There's the cobblestone parking area and launch area from down below the St. Louis Arch. We have launched from there and done some survey work in that area before. Always get to see some great views on the Mississippi River, especially if we're out this time of year. And of course, you get to meet some interesting people sometimes too. These kids were just out having some fun in the mud. I've referenced this a couple different times. Some of the older photos that you end up seeing, this Pearls and Pearling book. The thing that I think is really interesting with this, it was produced by Fur News Publishing. And in the back of the book, there were some articles on how to be a fur trapper, and then some of these articles about how to where and how to sell your pearls and your slugs and the things that you would collect from the freshwater mussels. Okay. And so with that kind of wraps up this part of the presentation on large rivers, and I'll take any questions that are out there.
Yeah, so far, I think everybody's just been enjoying the presentation.
Okay.
Oh, one question. Define large river.
Okay. So, that's kind of like when somebody says, hey, can you tell me the difference between a pond and a lake? That's left a little bit, I guess, to the eye of the beholder. When we talk about large rivers in Missouri, typically what we look at are the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the St. Francis. And primarily that's because those were places where we have allowed some commercial activity in the past. Commercial fishermen can fish those rivers. And at least in the Missouri and Mississippi, we would have allowed mussel harvest from them as well. Don't remember if we ever did in the St. Francis, but those are typically what we end up talking about with our large rivers.
Does that have to do with stream order?
Probably, but at the same time, it's not really something that I think I look at. Maybe even Steve may or may not as well. I look at our state that it does have these multi-state river systems that we're just a part of. And I think that's probably a little more what I look at. Many of our other streams, large parts of those basins are within our state. The Grand, the Osage, the Lamine, the Merrimack, most of those are within our state. And even though they're pretty good size and can have a lot of diversity in them, they don't really have the commercial capacities that the big rivers, the Missouri and Mississippi do.
And so the Osage would probably be also considered a large river.
And it could be. I mean, it was one of those things that the Osage at one time did have some navigation on it. It wasn't very effective navigation, but there is Lock and Dam 1, and it has quite a bit of a mussel resource in it as well. So might have been at some time some harvest would have happened a long time ago, especially when the button industry was first coming up.
So are any of the same species in large rivers also in any of the Corps of Engineers lakes here in Missouri?
There are a few species that we do find in the lakes. Not much is common in our lake habitat. Giant floaters you can find out there. I have found in Mark Twain Lake maple leaves that seem to be surviving and doing well in some certain sites. You may find some fat muckets in a few places. And then there's a species called a flat floater that really likes wetlands. They're a thin shelled, but they get to be fairly large. They grow quickly, and they're more accustomed to those short-term aquatic habitats, I guess you could say. But most of our stuff's going to be in the rivers, and I do see a lot of overlap of species between the Missouri and the Mississippi River and, say, the Fabius or the Salt River. The one thing that's a little bit different on the flip side is there are some species that are much more common in the Mississippi that are not common in our interior streams. And one I think of in particular is the butterfly. And butterflies are real common in the Mississippi. It's one of my most abundant species, but I rarely find them in our interior streams. And that's odd because I think channel catfish is the host for them. And so you would think there would be some channel cat that would run up those interior streams and help spread those populations, but I just rarely see butterfly and stuff in stream or inland.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow. Okay, I'm just gonna note about that. And let's see. Do we make any effort to cultivate mussel beds? Is there any value?
Yes, and that's something I got into a conversation with a couple of our panelists this morning. We're actually doing some work. So the Corps of Engineers has to maintain that navigation channel, and so they have these dikes. They have a variety of different structures that they put out there to try to keep that water in the channel. And sometimes those things can have negative impacts on freshwater mussels and those mussel beds because they need that right combination of flow and substrate in order to be there. And so one of the things that we've been working with them on, especially over the last several years, is starting to modify some of their projects so that they are more mussel friendly. And sometimes it's a very simple something. And an example is whenever they would build a dike in the Mississippi River or in the Missouri, one of the things that they would do is they would cap it off with this finer material to try to help lock everything in place. Well, freshwater mussels need softer substrate in order to burrow in, and oftentimes those fines that would settle in would be like concrete. And so I was in a meeting with some engineers, and we were talking about all this, and they said, so you just don't want us to put all those fines in there, and then you just want it to be able to fill with sand. And it was like, perfect. That's exactly what we want. Oh, well, we can do that. And so little things like that could mean big impacts for freshwater mussels and help them to expand their populations in the river.
Great. All right, 2 more questions.
Okay.
And Andrew had to get another good one. Have you noticed any difference in productivity of the upper Mississippi River after the introduction of the silver carp?
We've not seen huge differences related to silver carp. I know that there is a finite amount of food in the river. We like to think, okay, there's always stuff that's moving up and down, and that's true. But even though both the silver carp and the mussels are feeding on some of that material that's drifting by, we've not seen significant impacts that we would attribute to being a silver carp. Invasive species wise, the zebra mussels and quaggas in other parts of the Mississippi River have been much more a detriment. But we've even seen here locally, they're not quite as abundant as they once were in certain places. And I think a big part of that is our water temps in the Mississippi River can get to be up over 90 degrees, and that's where it starts to be fatal for zebra mussels. So a lot of times the only place we find them anymore is in the deeper water.
Great. Okay, and one more before we move on. Since mussels burrow into sand and gravel, are most mussel beds impermanent and transient? Or in other words, how can a mussel bed remain in the same location for a long time?
Okay, so there are some places that, because of the area habitat, so just as an example, here in Hannibal, there is a historic bed that's here on the Hannibal Riverfront that I would bet has probably been here since before the town was built. And part of what plays into that is on the Missouri side of the river, there's a bluff. And that's just immediately upstream of town. And so that has been, both a source for gravel and some cobble that would have fallen into the river over, the thousands of years. But it's also a stable site. And so you can have beds that are in place for long periods of time simply because they're in the right place. They've got the right substrate and the right flow to help keep those conditions there. But mistakes be made, or natural events can occur. A tree falls in at the wrong place and diverts flow or diverts the sediment. And you literally can have, it's happened before, that a single mussel bed can completely be wiped out because of a sand flow that covered it up. Consequently, we might be able to flip that a little bit too and create those conditions by putting some substrate in the right area or increasing the flow in a site just enough that it washes the sand away but leaves the pea gravel, and so you get mussels in those places. I find in the Mississippi River, whenever you come down the bank and you hit the toe, right in that area, there's usually a sweet spot. And there's a lot of my reach river that there is a mussel vein that's literally only about 3 feet wide. And that's the sweet spot where those mussels occur. And it may literally be miles and miles and miles long until the river starts to change sides or do other things.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Travis.
Okay. So with the mussel outreach activities, I'm going to show you just a variety of things that you can do that if you're at a fair, if you're talking to a youth group or a school group, or if you're even trying to expand your influence to some other folks. So if you were going to give a mussel presentation, here's some things that you can use. Okay. So the easiest one is if you're at a fair or you have some place where you have a booth, just collect some freshwater mussel shells, clean them up, and just lay them out on a table. And they are a definite conversation starter because people always want to come by and look and see what you have. They want to tell you stories about the mussels they've seen or collected. And it's just a great way to get people to stop at your booth and to start that conversation. The other thing you can do is if you've collected both sides, go in and label on one of the valves what that species is, but then put both sides out there and let, either kids or adults, let them match them up. And as they match them up, then they can see what species that one is. So that's a great way to help get folks involved and get them to stop by your booth. Another activity I've done for some weekend long events is I had a load of sand brought in and spread it out so it was about a foot deep across a parking lot or across a grassy area. And then I collected some the rolls from carpets and painted them up to look like logs. I took some spray foam and made these fake rocks, took some mussel shell and put out there. And then when a kid would come up, I'd say, okay, you're going to be a mussel diver now. And what I'd do is I would tie a rope around their waist, give them a bag to put their mussel shells into, and then you could either use a sleep mask or I used a set of laboratory goggles, and I just darkened them on the inside so they couldn't see, and said, okay, go out there and collect the mussels. And so they'd be feeling around on their hands and knees and find out what was out there. And then they would bring them back to you, and then you could sort through them, talk about whether or not it was a legal species that they could keep. Was it big enough? All of those sorts of things. And I get lots of repeat customers. The only suggestion that I'll make with this one is you want to keep in mind what time of year and how warm it is, because the sand can get really hot. So if it's going to be that case, you may want to put it in a shady area. You can put mussels in an aquarium, and I showed this slide down below earlier where they put some mussels, stirred up the sediment, and then watch to see what happens. If you do that, you can stir it up. Somebody may see what it looks like early on, and you can encourage them, hey, come back later and see what it is. So you get a second opportunity to talk to them. And then also, just if you have some substrate in there, they can see the mussels moving around. They can see the foot come out. I've used my stream table that way before as well, where I took out all the plastic beads, the urea, and then I took some pea gravel or sand and put in there. And if you do that, you either want to wash that material first, or you want to put it in the stream table and put a filter on there and run it for a couple hours ahead of time, because that gravel is not going to be as clean as you think it is. But then you can put your mussels in. People will come by, they can see the mussels crawling around, you can see the trails. It's a real neat way to demonstrate some of the mussels that are out there. I put this activity guide together about 25 years ago now, and included some different things that you could do in classrooms or with groups. Talk about how mussels are named. You know, we've got some real unique ones like a butterfly, a deer toe, monkey face. And it's real cool to look at all those different species. You can help show them how to age a mussel, talk about some of the uses, the color variations, all kinds of different activities. We also have MDC's Nature Unhooked curriculum, and in that curriculum, activity 4.5 is a mussel lures activity, and it's a match game. So what you end up doing is you take this sheet, print it off, cut it down into the individual sections, and you have one group of kids that are the fish, which are the hosts, and you have the other group of kids are the mussels. And so they're trying to find the mussel and the fish that match up together. And there's some background information with that activity as well. If you want to reach a completely different group, do a mussel program for a garden group, a quilting club, a sewing club, and invite everybody to bring in their mussel boxes or their mussel jars. My mother and my grandmother had cookie tins that they kept their buttons in. We used to use them as poker chips, and have them bring those in. Do your presentation, and then afterwards, everybody can sit down and start sorting through and see how many mussel shell buttons they have in there. And if they have a jar that's even this big, I guarantee you there are mussel shell buttons in there. So what are you going to be looking for? So here's what the mussel shells would look like. There's the initial blanks that would have been cut and eventually turned into buttons. And they may find some that are not from some of our native species. I would say probably all of these may be from ocean mussels, or maybe from mussels in other parts of the country. But you can see some of them, they have chipped edges. They're irregular shaped. They've got different texture to them. Or, you know, as they're sanded down, you may see these layers that develop in them. And then you can also look at the holes that were drilled for the threads. You can see they're kind of chipped. Plastic won't do that. These are going to be some mussel shell buttons. And as you start to see a lot of the ones that are more white, there's a better chance that those are from around here. They may have 2 holes, 4 holes, have some other scallops in it, may have a lot of different ornate decoration. But some things that you can look for is you may actually have that periosteum. The outside of the mussel shell may still be on there. Those are some things that you can look for. You may see these odd shapes that are worn away. You may see the chipping on the edges and on the buttonholes. But I think the view that really kind of brings it out the most is this one, where you can see the terrain, the texture of those mussel shell buttons. And you can see this one was thick on this side but got thin. You can see on this one that it fades away and gets shallow again. Same on to these. And then I was pointing this one out to Amy earlier. On the front side of the button was the real pearly, the nacre side of the button. But as you start moving your way up, you can see you get this heavier white, and that would have been closer to the periosteum, closer to the outside of the shell. And so those are just a few of the things that you can look for in those buttons. Another resource that you may want to tap into, either in yourself or with some other groups, is the Freshwater and Mollusk Conservation Society, which is the professional group of mussel enthusiasts. And Texas Parks and Wildlife put together the North American Freshwater Mussel Identification Guide. It's an app you can get on your phone, and it goes through, it breaks the country down into zones that you can search for different mussels. You can look them up by individual Latin or common name, or you can do this identify, and it takes you through a series of characteristics like the shell color or the shell shape, whether it's texture, all of those sorts of things. And you can select those features, and hopefully that works its way down to a few species that your mussel may be. It's not perfect, and that's just like with what Steve said the other night. We go to Zen malacology. Not all mussel shells of the same species look alike, and so it's a good general guide to get you started and get you pointed in the right direction. Wisconsin DNR had something that I utilized a few years ago, and it was called Patty Pocketbook, and it was an anatomically correct plush mussel puppet. And the thing that was really cool with it was they would, this Patty Pocketbook, the parts were Velcroed in. And so you could take off the upper shell, you could pull out the foot, you could do the gills, the marsupial gills that where the glochidia were, like here in this photo. It even had a freshwater pearl in there, and it was really cool. It was great for demonstrations. Unfortunately, they were so popular they don't let them out of Wisconsin anymore. But if somebody is really crafty and wants to try to make one, I might be able to get my hands on one and we can put one together. So I'm definitely interested if you think you can put one of these together. They also have some product, or an old storybook that was called The Story of My Life by Billy Button. And it was a booklet that was produced by the button manufacturers. And it went through the whole process of how a button was made. The graphs that I showed in the earlier presentation about the historic harvest was some of the activity or some of the information that they had. And then there's this reproduction demo. And I always get lots of laughs with this one because this one is dated. And some of my cohorts pick on me a little bit. This is me back in 1998, and I'm going to let it play. It's going to be a little bit jerky, but I think you'll get the point of what it's after. I am the male mussel out here in our stream. My lovely wife, Kathy, who is a conservation educator with the Department of Conservation here in Hannibal, is my female mussel. And as we mentioned, our mussels are out there, and streams have current. And so you can see we have our current now. And I'm going to cast my genetic material out into the stream. And there's lots of males of different species that may be in an area because a mussel bed oftentimes does include quite a few different species. So there's a lot of material that's being cast out into the current at the reproduction time for several different species because their reproduction can overlap. Our female mussel's downstream. She's trying to catch this material. She's actually siphoning it, and she can identify what belongs to her species. And if she catches what belongs with her, she'll go ahead, fertilize her eggs, and produce those juvenile mussels. If it's from a species that's not hers, then she may consume it, or she may put it in a pseudo-feces packet and then expel it out into the river. My wife says that's a lot of work. And as she collects the material, you can see a lot of different colors. Only one of them would be for her species. But as you can see, we were successful and we created a baby mussel. And I can tell you that the baby mussel that's there right now, he's 21 years old and he's in college. There are lots of books and pamphlets out there that you can get. Missouri has our older pamphlets. There's the Freshwater Mussels of the Upper Mississippi River, and it includes a lot of species you may find in interior streams as well. And then we have our free publication, and almost every state does have a book or booklet that you can get access to. So if you travel, be sure and pick up something in the state that you're in. There are lots of posters out there. This is a Big Rivers poster. And, you know, it was nice that they included mussels in here. The thing that always hangs me up on this one, though, is they've got all the mussels facing the wrong way. They're all upside down. And while that can happen, that's not near as common. This was a better one. You can see that there are mussels in several places out here. They're actually in the upright position like they should be. And there's even a couple of them right here that are displaying. So this is a cool poster that's out there as well. Some of the states have identification posters, so you can pick those up, and those end up being prized items as well. There's the America's Pearly Mussel website that's produced by Virginia Tech. This is still an active site, so if you type in America's Pearly Mussels, you'll come up with that. And they have a curriculum out there. They used to produce the posters and some videos, and I think those things may still be available in some form as well. There's a book called Russell the Mussel, and it goes through the life of Russell the Mussel. And then there's these couple of websites. And I've mentioned the Freshwater Mollusk Conservation Society before. Again, that's the professional group, but if you want to go to their website, you can see what all is out there. And I'm going to show this bottom video real quick. It's going to show a little bit herky-jerky, but I'll point out a couple of things here, and I may stop it so that you can see certain things. This is a short video that I made. We were out doing some sampling, and there was a mussel that was displaying at the time. And right here is the outline of the mussel. Right here is one side of the lure. Here's the other side of the lure. And there are eye spots up here. And in this particular video, we had caught it displaying. See if it, stop. So right here, you can see the eye spots. And so it was, you can produce your own video and you can use in a classroom situation or somewhere else. Okay. The other one that I'm going to show, and I realized since I clicked on it earlier, it's a different color. There's an older show that was on PBS. It was called Newton's Apple, and it was an interesting educational show. And one day I happened to be flipping through the channels, and Newton's Apple was on, and I paused on it, and they were showing how a cultured pearl was made. And they don't include the part about the freshwater mussel being harvested and the nuclei made, but what they do show is how that cultured pearl bead is placed into the pearl, how they examine it, how they recover it, the whole shooting match. It doesn't play well through this presentation, but if you go out and you search for Newton's Apple and making a pearl, you can find that episode, and that video is available online. It's older, it's a little bit grainy, but it's very interesting and a great way to see how those pearls are made. And from there, if there are any questions on some of the educational stuff, I'll leave this up for just a little bit, but I do also want to throw out a big thank you to Amy for setting these up, because she's been the force behind it from in the background, helping to get us all together and helping us do these presentations. And she's kind of been the unsung hero, because she's taking care of all this WebEx stuff so that the rest of us that are presenting just have to go and do our thing. So thanks to Amy for all the work you've been doing.
And thank you. I can't thank you enough, Travis, for just being a part of all of it, and your support for the Stream Team program. It really means a lot. I did have one question that came in. Let's see. Oh, from Katie up in St. Joe. Are there any regulations we should be aware of in order to collect live mussels for displays?
Sure.
Can we keep them, or should we release them after we do our outreach program?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always recommend, and this is part of how things play in as far as making sure that we maintain some biological integrity in individual streams. If you're doing something as part of the Stream Team program or through an MDC program, then there are some opportunities to go out and collect those. If you're going to get very many, always recommend that you give Steve a call or kind of coordinate with him as well. He may want you to do a collector's permit or something like that, just so we can keep track of how many are being collected out there. And then the thing that I would suggest to you is collect from a single individual stream or an individual source, and then when you're done, take them back to that same site. And then that way you're not introducing any other species, you're not introducing any potential diseases or anything else to that system. That's something that we've done in the past is I've literally gone out to some of my better interior stream sites, collected some stuff, and then once that event's over, I take them right back to the same place I collected them from.
Yes, and if you are a stream team, and if you've been water quality trained, you do not need a collector's permit to collect invertebrates, and mussels
Right.
obviously qualify as an invertebrate. Other than that, though, I think if you are not a stream team member, you would probably need to have a fishing permit. Am I
Right.
correct on that?
Yeah. So you can, with a fishing permit, you can collect up to 5 mussels, and that's 2 halves, or two half shells. So if you collected 5 live animals, you could do that and put it in an aquarium. And I can tell you that the mussels will keep in an aquarium. You can keep them for days or even weeks if you really needed to. But you wouldn't want to make sure that you've got an air pump, some way to keep them oxygenated. And then you have to keep in mind too that they do filter feed. So the longer you keep them in there, they're not feeding unless you're adding feed to that system. And so if you wanted to keep them for a few days or a week, in an office setting or something, especially if you had stuff that was displaying, we've had stuff in our office aquarium in the past that we brought in, let them display for a short period of time, and then took them back out to the river. And then that way they could go ahead and hopefully get onto a host fish out there as well.
And then what would you provide as feed?
A lot of that I'm going to kick back to Chris Barnhart. When Chris has done a lot of studies, they have some material that they produce, but you could even just from time to time, you could harvest, collect some water from the field and pour in there, and they're going to filter out what they could get. It's just hard to keep them long term. If you were to keep them for months, eventually they're going to start to die off. And I will tell you, because I had a staff member made this mistake. There are a number of fish diseases. So if you have fish in your aquarium as well, there are a number of fish diseases that the best treatment for is to add salt to the aquarium. Do not do this if you have mussels in there. Freshwater mussels are very salt sensitive, and you will smoke them very quickly. They do not tolerate the salt at all.
That's really good to know.
It's good to know. I happened to be gone for a week. Fish were showing a little bit of stress issues, and so the staff member jumped salt in there. They came in the next day, and every mussel was dead.
All right, and then one other question was, if someone asked you at an outreach event, what can we do in our lives to help mussels? What would you say?
Sure. So, just being aware. We all have influence on the activities that go on in our area. So if you happen to be, own property that's along a stream and it has stable habitat, it may have mussels in it already, helping to make sure that we maintain that corridor, that we maintain those stable sites. That's something you could do. Being aware of, we talk about road salt. A lot of highway departments are starting to use other sorts of materials because that salt that washes off can have negative impacts on mussels in our stream. So just being aware of some of those everyday things. And then, we always talk about, the Drains to Streams program and making sure that municipal water and those sorts of things are going through those processing plants. Those are some everyday things that we just need to be aware of. And then as we're talking to the leaders and landowners and all those folks in our communities that we can have influence on. So all of those are helpful.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just everything that we do in the Stream Team program is to help protect, stream, our stream life, our stream corridors, the hydrology, everything that we do in the Stream Team program is to help protect our streams. So every little thing you can do, just even picking up trash in your neighborhood, makes a big difference. It makes
And absolutely, I didn't include those photos in this one. We have found before. I have an old photo that has a very tiny mussel that had gotten wedged into a soda can ring, and that mussel continued to grow, but it eventually was going to have problems. Plastic rings, rubber bands, oil filter rings, all of those sorts of things that can get into our systems can even impact mussels. I ran into a kid years ago that somebody had thrown out an old Coke bottle, and there was a mussel inside of the Coke bottle. It had continued to get enough water for oxygen and feed, but it eventually got to the point where it was big enough, it was not going to come out of the bottle without breaking the bottle.
Yep, and that happens with fish, it happens with crayfish, it happens
Yep.
even with invertebrates, so other aquatic invertebrates like insects. So, yeah, no, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Travis. This has been a wonderful presentation. I think we've all gotten a lot out of it. We had 23 participants today, so that's great. But for those who couldn't make it, for those who did make it and want to share it with your friends, I will have this posted on the Stream Team YouTube page later today. So again, thank you, Travis. What a wonderful presentation, such great information. And I hope everybody has an awesome weekend. It's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Beautiful weather. Get out into a stream, collect some mussel shells, flip rocks and look at bugs, and find everything that you can out there to enjoy our streams.